Good. I'm Aromar Revi. I'm the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, also co-chair of UNSDSN, and I sit on the boards of Cities Alliance and UNICDR. This is the first webinar that we're going to be running with you on Cities MOOC. I'm really glad to be back with you. This is the third time that we're running this, and I hope we have participants from pretty much across the world. I'm going to try and sort of lay out some of the contemporary questions that we've addressed this week and some of the ongoing challenges that we are trying to address in the sort of global urban context. So we launched this course after 2015 and the SDG Summit, as some of you may have sort of heard or made out as we've gone through this process. This was a process which brought together all the countries of the world, especially both the global north and south, to try and lay out a global development framework that was applicable to the rich and the poor, to countries from the south and the north, that is, the poor and the rich countries. And for the first time since the United Nations was created in the late 1940s or 1950s, it set out a special and particular goal around sustainable cities and communities. So over this this course, you will be meeting some of the key people in the world who helped define this agenda, to negotiate this between the 193 member states or countries of the UN, and also actively work on questions of sustainable urbanization in many parts of the world. I think there are 25, 30 of us who've come together to bring this to you. The question, of course, that's sort of on our minds at the current point of time. In fact, yesterday and today there's been a fairly significant meeting of most of the major urban groups in Barcelona, is how do we actually try and implement this agenda? So there's a framework that's there, which basically starts within the 17 SDGs with dealing with how we address the question of extreme poverty, how do we address the question of hunger. And of course, this is a question that not only is important in rural areas, but also important in urban areas. In fact, one of the more important questions that we try to address over this week is the connection between the rural and the urban. Historically, there's been this artificial bifurcation which says that, if you're working on rural development, you work in villages. If you're working in urban development, you work in metropolitan areas. Increasingly across the world, whether it's North America or Latin America or Asia or even Africa, we find that these sort of definitions are not very useful. They're actually quite blurred and they're quite interesting. So one of the core questions that we're trying to address is now, not for large metropolitan cities alone, not from the kind of cities that C40, which works on, let's say, 90 big metropolitan cities that control, let's say, something like 20 or 30% of the world economy are focused on, but all of the places that we're interested in. That is, notionally, at least I would say 10 to 20,000 places across the world, depending on which part of the world you come from. They would range from villages and small towns, large villages and small towns, all the way up to metropolitan centers. So places that have 5 to 10,000 people, all the way up to places that have about 10 or 15 million people. And in this context, we're talking about a universal agenda, and in that universal agenda in which you try and enable the provision of basic services to everybody, to provide safe and adequate housing, to address energy poverty, which means also providing energy for everybody, especially clean energy, as we're seeing the solar revolution expand across the world. But ensuring that in doing this, we address one of the most important questions that I think the world is facing at the moment, that is, how do you create enough jobs? So we're talking about the creation of anywhere between 400 to 500 million new jobs from across the world. And obviously, cities are central in making that happen. But more than the economic questions in some senses, the real challenges that we're faced in, especially in the global south, is addressing questions of inequality, addressing questions of culture, of identity, and of course, the concentration of risk along with the concentration of opportunity that we find in urban areas across the world. So as you'll see in this opening week, we've tried to cover a whole range of themes on why cities and urban areas are important, the sort of cultural and economic underpinnings of that process, and then trying to go into a little bit more detail of how power and power dynamics in the politics and the political economy of city plays itself out. And I guess you've heard Professor Peterson talk about that. And then two modules that looked more closely at research and how we try and conceptualize and problematize dealing with this very complex, but in some senses relatively simple system of systems that we call cities. So we're looking at the economic, the social, the cultural, and the environmental dimensions in a holistic manner. And this holistic framework is what we call the Sustainable Development Goals. And within that, there is one that focuses on sustainable cities and communities. So I see people from a wide range of places. I see colleagues here from the UK, from Morocco, from Mexico City. Some people are obviously getting up very early and coming in quite late. I see somebody coming in from Montreal, from the UAE. People with very wide range of backgrounds. There are architects. There are people working on environment. There are people working on planning systems. And there's somebody, I think, from outside India who's asking about our Prime Minister in India's work on 100 smart cities. So we're very glad to have all of you. And I guess we're ready now to start looking at particular questions that we want to take.
So Hugo wants to know as to how do they look forward to understanding more about our Prime Minister's plan for the 100 smart cities from the Smart Cities Challenge that has been announced in India, and where do we stand today?
So this is a tricky question because it's a question that tries to relate a very forward-looking vision, where the Indian Prime Minister essentially said that after many decades, India is now sort of focusing on trying to look at the urban opportunity. It's a country in which there have been great debates between whether we should focus on rural development and rural poverty, but also how does one deal with the opportunities that urbanization provides. And given that India is a service sector-driven economy, manufacturing is probably just under 20% of our economic output, while services is in the high 40s, early 50s in terms of economic output. Obviously, trying to integrate technology and a whole range of technological dimensions is something that's important. Now, within the SDG frame, the idea of connectedness is a central element that we use to try and look at the opportunity that cities provide. So the connectedness, of course, is provided by people coming together in a particular space, and of course, the concentration of resources and of infrastructure. But what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years is it's not only the physical connectedness and the resources that are important, but also the opportunity for people to be engaged in economic activity, the availability of information technology, the availability of opportunities for people to actually interact with each other, which creates new ideas and entrepreneurship that's important. So the 100 sort of smart cities was an attempt by the government of India to sort of kickstart this process in 100 places through a sort of competitive regime. It is doing probably better in theory than in practice, because working in a sort of low middle income country is much more complex and challenging than it seems from a distance. So of these 100 cities, I would say 15 or 20 of them actually have got plans that are moving forward. They've engaged with their citizens. They're starting to implement some of these processes. But let's say this is not as far ahead as we would have liked it to be. There are some significant structural barriers that have to be addressed, whether you are smart or not smart. You have to address questions of employment, of basic infrastructure, of land markets, etc., if you need to take this forward. So I would imagine that in the next cycle of our parliamentary elections, this is going to be an important question that needs to be addressed, because we will not get where we would expect it to get by May 2019. Though some cities will do that, but I guess all 100 will take some time to get there.
Vibha, who has a background in architecture, would like to know that even though there are such large broad level plans that are there in the cities, but how do we deal with the macro level issues that are there in the cities? And that is basically causing more problems.
okay, how do we deal with questions of housing? Now, this is very different in different parts of the world, but there's some things that are actually quite common, and that is when you're looking at housing at a mass scale, as we see in many parts of the global south, whether it's in Brazil or in South Africa or Nigeria or in East Asia, the fundamental question is a question of how one deals with the question of land, access to affordable land, because in many parts of the world, the cost of buildings themselves may make up less than 20, 30%, in some cases maybe 10% of the actual provision of the housing itself. So I think security of land tenure is one of the most difficult challenges that we face across the world. And we work on this question. Many colleagues who are on this cycle will actually talk about this. So that's a fundamental problem, and people have dealt with this in different places. So Brazil dealt with it through the statutes of the cities and trying to enable people across Brazil, especially people in vulnerable situations, people who actually went in and occupied particular areas, by giving them security of tenure. In other parts of the world, like in China, for example, there's been a whole systematic process for actually developing areas, often in the periphery of cities, where people from the center were moved out. Housing was actually provided for them, and you have a rapid growth of urban areas. So the housing question has to be basically addressed in a local context. The other challenge that most governments face, for example, in developing housing policy, is they look at it as an aggregate question, which is probably not the right way to do it. You really have to slice it by income class, by the kind of circumstances people live in, and you can't use one-size-fits-all solutions to work with it. So there may be people in many parts of the world who are rich and can afford market-based solutions. There may be others who live on footpaths or who are entirely dispossessed in terms of housing, who do require not only state support, but they need state protection to enable their rights in some senses to housing to be exercised. And in between, you need a range of different instruments, some of them market-based, some of them a mix of market and public provision, to make this possible. And of course, housing is not only about buildings, it's essentially about economic development, it's about culture, it's also about the access to basic services. So it's a whole package of different opportunities. And some parts of the world have done much better than others in trying to sort of address these questions. But we've got a long way to go. We're talking about providing adequate housing to somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people over the next 15 years or so across the world. And especially since there's this commitment that governments have made in the SDGs to put the last first, it means that we have to take, I would imagine, a fairly radical view of how this needs to be addressed.
Peter from UK would like to ask, how do you think the principles behind the circular economy can support the development of sustainable cities in both the global north and global south?
Now, what the circular economy tries to do is try to balance, three different things. One, of course, is the idea of economic growth, which has some challenges in a world which is constrained by planetary boundaries and by climate change and a whole range of other environmental concerns. So that's one thing. Economic growth, which is, in a sense, been a driver of a whole range of development over the last, 50, 60, 70 years. The question of being able to provide jobs for everybody, decent jobs for everybody, because they're tied together, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And the third thing is of trying to conserve environmental resources and address critical environmental questions, whether it is air pollution in China, or it is a question of river pollution in other places. And the circular economy, in some senses, internalizes stuff that we have been putting into the environment and sort of enables a much clearer restructuring of the economy. So you take into account environmental externalities. It tries to address questions of inequality in its widest sense. So there are very few places in the world where the circular economy is actually, taken root. I think in places like Scandinavia, in some other parts of in smaller, in smaller metropolitan or smaller countries, you can see this actually trying to work itself out. But inevitably, we have to move, I would say, certainly in the next generation or generation and a half, into a world which embraces this principle. And that is that economic growth is not an aim in itself. It exists to be able to enable people to live a full life, to achieve what they would like to, their full human potential. And while disparities and inequalities may help to address a short range. In the long range, given the environmental constraints that we have in a planet which now has, 7.5 billion people going to 9 billion people on it, and severe impacts on the economy, we have to address this question pretty seriously. So we're going to try and pick this up, and there will be examples as we go forward of how this would work out in different contexts. But as you well know, cities are not closed systems; they're open systems. So a city like London, for example, imports a large amount of its food and a lot of its, of energy and fuel. So if, let's say, exports to the UK and the ports were shut for a few days, London would be in a tremendous crisis in some senses. So we need to be able to look both at what can be handled locally, but also at not trying to shift the burden of those environmental impacts or even economic impacts on people on the outside who don't have the opportunity then to participate because they have no political rights in your particular context.
So Parul would like to know, how can we alleviate poverty by the SDGs without dealing with the political agendas that perpetuate inequality? And since we are also talking about smart cities, Celia from Madrid would like to ask, how can enterprises contribute to smart cities?
So I guess the quick response to the poverty question is, of course, you cannot address poverty without addressing the political agenda. Because whether it's gender inequality or it's a question of class or caste, these are situated within a context of political power. And as Edgar Peterson would have shown you with the cube, these are processes that are absolutely central to the way that not only cities function, but how regional hierarchies play themselves out. So whether it's within a city or even within a neighborhood, the question of power and politics are going to be very important. Of course, not all of us actually live in countries which are entirely democratic. In democratic countries, there are certain ways of addressing this question. In others, in countries that have sort of mixed kind of systems that are there are different ways of dealing with it. So it's a very diverse world in some senses. And hence, the question of localization, the question of addressing implementation of dealing with poverty and, let's say, hunger or even access to jobs are going to be different in different places. Now, the enterprise sector is very important in enabling this because in some countries in the world, even now, the state or public sector enterprises are the key drivers of employment. But in many parts of the world, the central challenge in the urban economy is what we call informality. And that means that people who actually work either for themselves or in self-owned enterprises in their houses, and you can see that in informal settlements. I've seen that pretty much across the world. In Latin America, you can find that in Thailand, you can find that in Philippines, you can find that pretty much in other parts of the world, in Egypt. The informal economy dominates the urban economy. And in many ways, the question is, what is an enterprise? Very often, those of us who look at the formal sector as the only legitimate form of enterprises see large multinational corporations, whether it's in the service sector, like, let's say, Google or Facebook or whatever it is, or if it were in the retail sector, like Walmart, or if it were in the manufacturing sector, and you have a whole range of different enterprises that influence our life in cities. They are, in a sense, what enterprises represent. But in actual fact, even though they may control a significant proportion of the world economic output in that particular sector, in actual practice, in terms of employment, and in the global south, also in terms of output, the bulk of the employment comes from the informal sector. So in some senses, real smart cities will be those that enable people in the informal sector, people who don't have a full range of social securities, to be able to participate equally or more equally in the economy. And that's how, in some senses, you're really not only putting the last first, you're dealing with the most vulnerable and the most poor, but you're also trying to put the most backward regions within a country, or the most backward or most disadvantaged regions and parts of cities in the forefront of trying to address this question. So smartness is in trying to connect all of these processes together.
Kareem, who's from New Zealand, would like to ask, do we consider the socio-ecological resilience approach to urban areas and relate it to the systems theory?
Well, socio-ecological systems, as we've sort of tried to articulate, and you'll figure over the rest of the course, are a subset of a larger sort of frame of different ways of looking at things, which we call general systems theory. So socio-ecological systems actually cut the world in particular ways. There are other ways of looking at the same process. So people who work on technology often talk of socio-technical systems. So innovation in socio-technical systems, for example, how quickly do let's say mobile phones or smartphones penetrate a particular market, and how innovation actually takes place is something that is pretty well explained through socio-technical systems and innovation theory in some senses, or how disruption works in that space. While if you want to try and understand, for example, how resource flows take place in an urban area, how that relates to the political economy of urbanization, how that relates to, let's say, food security, if you're looking at let's say, food resources that work that run through a city, would be easier to understand through a socio-ecological approach. So there are many different ways to try to look at this sort of complex environment, what we call the system of systems of cities. And these are two framing concepts, and we'll be introducing you to them as we proceed over the next many weeks that we will spend together.
So the next question, Sarah would like to know, with regard to the massive influx of people from rural areas to the cities, if the SDG also addresses the social and economic vacuum that is being created in the rural communities.
Now, this is a contested question. I'm not going to say that, it's not. In some contexts, there is a significant movement of people from rural to urban areas. But in many parts of the world, what we're seeing as what is called the urban explosion is made up of at least three parts. The first part is the actual growth of urban populations. What people often forget is urban populations grow on their own because they have their own natural growth rate. And in many parts of the world, including in Africa, where this is attributed in some senses, the urban fertility rates and growth rates are quite high on their own. And then the second reason why there's a growth of people in cities is because of reclassification. So you have a place which is a village with a population of, let's say, 7,800. In the next census period, it becomes 10,000. And in some countries, that will be counted as a town. So it becomes a city. So there's a reclassification. And the third is the movement of people from rural to urban areas. But in some parts of the world, you actually find the reverse, that people actually move in times of economic distress from urban areas to rural areas. So we have to look at net rural and urban migration. So let's say in some parts of the world, like I'll give you the example of India, over the last 40 years or so, the net rural-urban migration has been less than 20%, or something of the order of 20% of the increment of the total growth of urban population. Now, that's not true in other parts of the world. In Latin America, over, let's say, going from the 50s to the 90s, we saw a massive movement of people from rural to urban areas, not only because of the fact that cities provide you jobs and opportunities to educate your children and maybe a better place to live, but because of the change in the structure of the economy. As the agrarian economy became less and less able to provide livelihoods for people, they looked at new ways to find ways to sort of, of livelihood in different parts of the world. So these are different things, and we really need to unbundle them in different contexts. As some of you may know, large metropolitan cities may seem very large and very congested, but in many parts of the world, their growth rates are actually not only stabilizing, but actually declining in share. So the most important places in the planet today are not the large metropolitan cities in terms of population growth, or even in terms of enterprise and economic activity. It is really the smaller towns. And in some senses, that's a good thing, because the opportunity of enabling sustainability to enable transitions in places that are 100,000, 500,000 in size are much more than if you are sitting with a large metropolitan center with very complex governance, political, and a whole range of other economic questions, which is, let's say, 10 million in size or more, as we can see in the case of, let's say, Mexico City or Tokyo, Yokohama, or even in some of the larger metropolitan regions in the United States.
In line with that, we have another question which asks, how should the jurisdictions balance urbanization and rural development?
Now, that's a very interesting question. And frankly, the answer to this is different in every country in the world. We have no formal definition of what an urban area is. This is what the United Nations Pop Division struggles with across the world for a long, long time. And that is, every country has a different definition of what an urban area is or not. So we have, there's no traditional cutoff that says that anything above a certain size is urban. But by and large, there are 2 or 3 different characteristics that are used. One is population size, the second is density, and the third very often is the kind of economic activity that's there. Given the assumption that urban areas will have people who are largely sort of occupied in non-agrarian populations. So the question then is, how do you draw the boundaries? Because the system boundaries, what is urban, what is peri-urban, what is rural, very often determine not only questions of economic development, but also questions of entitlement. So till very recently in China, there were 2 very different systems. So people in rural areas had what was called a rural hukou, so which means when they came to an urban area to take a job in, let's say, a factory, they did not actually have the entitlements that people who had an urban hukou actually had. So they did not have access to education, healthcare for their children. They had a whole range of different challenges that they had in terms of access to public services. That's changing also in China because of a whole range of new experiments that the current government is trying to work out. Russia also had a similar kind of system at some point of time. So in some countries, there's a very clear definition of what is rural and what is urban. In actual practice, we know that it is a continuum. But in some parts of the world, people would like to stay rural because, for example, they may not need to pay property taxes. In other parts of the world, they want to become urban because when they become urban, they have access to a whole range of urban services and entitlements and protection, let's say, under the statute of cities that they may not get if they were in a rural area or rural municipality. So defining these boundaries is quite important, but what we must recognize is that A, this is a system, and B, that there's a continuum. So we can't be too rigid about that because that's not how the world works. But when you're in administration or in management, it's sometimes easy to turn things into black and white, but that's not how the world works in some senses.
So the next question, Hugo would like to know, how does citizen engagement work in promoting smart cities, and what strategies do we have in order to achieve this? Following that, Luciana, on the same lines, would like to know, how can we bring all the stakeholders at the right time, in the right place, and guarantee that the synergies are promoted and trade-offs are avoided?
Well, the first thing cities will tell you is that there's no guarantee about anything. That, there are a whole range of processes that emerge. You can't control them. I mean, think about mayors who get thrown out of after one term of being a mayor. So they know all bets are off in terms of actually defining a clear pathway to things. There's no determinacy as far as planning and processes are concerned because these are complex systems in which there are a whole range of stakeholders that are pushing back and contesting and doing a whole range of things together. But as a system, they're able to actually help and transform. That's to transform processes because the whole is much more than its individual parts. But a critical thing in many parts of the world is the question of how I would say a core set of stakeholders in this actually function, behave, and work together. And those are citizens, right? So given that the idea of the city and the citizens are sort of tied together, this has been an old debate, which is at least, I would say, 5,000 years old, about what is the relationship between the citizen, the dweller, the resident, and the city. And these are interesting categories. There's a lot of theorization around it. The idea of the right to the city is tied into this question. So really being able to bring these stakeholders together, especially citizens, is quite important. And you have multiple different ways of doing that. I've shown that to you. So if you look at what happened during the so-called Arab Spring, where hundreds of thousands of people came into the centers of their city, or the contests that we've seen in countries like Turkey in terms of public spaces, or the mass demonstrations that we've seen around questions of identity and migration in some parts of Europe, or what you've seen in other places like Hong Kong. The engagement now, especially with the availability of social media and smartphones, means that citizens can participate in processes of decision-making, of having their voices heard, of actually engaging with a whole range of economic and political activity in a way that was unprecedented. I mean, you can mobilize flash mobs in cities with half an hour's notice because rapid transit systems and smartphones give you the ability to bring together 1,000 or 10,000 people in a particular place to demonstrate or participate in either a cultural activity or say that they do not like, let's say, the violence against women that has become quite common in some parts of the world. So I think the notions of citizenship and democracy are changing, and we're going to explore some of those questions over this course. And I think it's going to be interesting for you not only to hear from us, but also to share experiences, as many of you literally will come from maybe 50 or 60 different countries from across the world.
Yeah, so Sarah wants to know, do you see the sharing economy taking up a more prominent seat than it has in recent times in order to meet the sustainable cities goal? And also Mohammed would like to know, how can we address the issue of trade-offs between sustainability and economic growth?
Okay, both interesting questions. So Sarah, the sharing economy works in some parts of the world. And even in those parts of the world where the sharing economy has become, more active and more interesting, let's say if I take the United States, what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 decades actually is a huge polarization of not only income. There's poverty. Last number I saw yesterday was there are, I guess, 45, 50 million people in the US who are actually poor, not by standards in parts of Africa and maybe Asia, but certainly in their own context. So, apart from the question of poverty, the real issue is really around the polarization of wealth. So we've seen a massive growth in the concentration of wealth in the upper echelons of society, whether it's 1% or 5%, or it depends on how you actually put it. So a very small number of people control a large proportion of the wealth. And as Piketty, who you will encounter over the next few weeks, has shown us very clearly, with this concentration of wealth inequality, which of course is driven by how the urban economy is structured, what you privilege. If you privilege high interest rate on financial capital over human capital, you get certain outcomes. So people who control financial capital, like banks and financial institutions, will actually reap the benefits of economic growth and development, because as things grow, a larger proportion or share of those resources which come from wealth will go to them, vis-a-vis people who actually labor and in a sense support cities in many parts of the world. So the circular economy and also the sharing economy are important facets of looking at this process, but unless we are able to address at a very fundamental level questions of inequality of income, inequality of wealth, inequality of opportunity, these are ideas that will not be operationalized. And hence, as you see in the SDG framework, and you will get to know it better as you go through, there are very clear goals around dealing with gender equality and economic inequality at the same time. That's the reason why they've been called out specifically. These are long and difficult struggles that people have fought for a long period of time. So it's not only about basic services and poverty and housing and industrialization and stuff like that, but inequality is a very serious question that needs to be addressed. And I guess one of the really difficult questions of trade-offs that Mohammed is asking me a question on is about what comes first. And this is really a contextualized question. So you may have a global framework which applies in a sense to everybody across the world, but in a particular geography, let's say in Rio de Janeiro, for example, the first thing that people may be most concerned about may be questions of personal security and safety because of the particular conflicts that are happening in that particular place. In other areas, it may be questions of employment. So the trade-offs and synergies in some senses between the goals are things that have to be addressed and engaged with locally in that local context. And that's why this dialogue between local and regional governments and national governments is so important. Because the national government may want to go in a certain direction, but the city on one part of the country versus the city on the other part of the country may have very different ways or different priorities to try and deal with. So they have to sort that out. And that's why the dialogue between communities, citizens, other stakeholders, and governments is very important. Because collectively, they can come to an understanding of what's important. And as collective processes boil up from below, you have both bottom-up and top-down processes, which will eventually help us try and address these very challenging objectives, which in some cases actually conflict with each other.
With regards to dearth of infrastructure, land, and the growth of it, Kruti would like to ask, shouldn't we enhance or strengthen the existing public transport system rather than introducing new public transportation in any city? And also, since housing is another pertinent question in infrastructure, Sarah would like to know what are some of the incentives that will encourage the private sector to invest in affordable housing?
So I'll separate the two questions or the responses out first. So in terms of public infrastructure for mobility, each city in a sense is like a different person, like a different personality. Some cities are growing very rapidly, and you have to build new infrastructure because there are new areas that are being built or areas that are being re-densified. So people do need to get around and move. Other places are much more stable, and there, if you take many parts of Europe, or let's say some parts of Australia also, you find a trend that we've been seeing for some time, which is not obvious to people who don't look at it, and that is we find motorization, that is the use of individual trips in the motor cars actually declining over time. So in many parts of Europe, in some parts of North America, and in some parts of Australia, we find that we've already reached a position where we've crossed the peak car sort of, sort of the upper bound of peak car use in cities. So by and large, if you want to try and move towards sustainability, you do need to move towards both active transportation, which means people are actually walking and using active transportation like cycles and stuff like that, and also significant use of public transport. Why? Because what that means is the city is actually much more compact and not driven by a tremendous amount of sprawl, which in some senses is a cancer that's afflicted cities across the world. As we have adopted more and more the idea of the motor car. The motor car, in some senses, is not only a challenge because it enables sport and suburbanization, but it's also a significant driver of the fossil fuel economy, which is creating some of the most serious challenges that we have in the world, both in terms of climate change and air pollution at the same time. So by enabling walkable, accessible cities with high levels of public transportation that actually work, and we've got lots of examples of this across the world, you're enabling not only a much more equitable and more efficient city, which enables greater economic development, but you're actually helping improve the quality of life and the health of people who are living in them. So it's a win-win on all counts. Try and do that. So the question of public transport is tied to what kind of city it is, what people can afford. In some places, bus rapid transport might be the way to actually deal with transit. In other areas, depending on scale and size, we might be talking about actually building out metro systems. In other places, which are much smaller, you can actually manage with electric buses and electric vehicles, or a mix of all of them. So it's a very context-dependent question, and I think you will be encountering an old friend and colleague, Professor Peter Newman, who's one of the world's experts in this, when he talks about this question in our session on mobility and transport, way down, I think, a few weeks from now. Sorry. There's a question on the incentives on as far as private participation in affordable housing. I think the critical thing here, of course, is, like I mentioned earlier, is where is the land going to come from? Who's going to actually subsidize or provide the land? And this is a question that is, is both important in a city like London. London is struggling at the current point of time. The mayor is and the boroughs are struggling just now because there's been a major sort of lack of attention to this question for, I would say, almost 2 decades or so. So even in a large metropolitan city, in a country that is, an advanced economy that has a lot of resources, we have great challenges of trying to attract the private sector to help support council housing. So you have to address the question of both land and mobility and access to jobs to be able to address this question. There are attempts to create magic bullets around using PPP to try and deal with this. In other places, you use a lot of state-driven processes. And, I guess you have to use a mix of these policy measures to try and deliver on this question. And of course, the other big sort of hidden question that people don't really ask is, what is private? Is a private a large $1 million developer, a large construction firm? Or could you count a community of 5,000 residents who actually come and build their own communities being private? So the answer is different in different contexts. But if you look at Brazil's big program of sort of building houses over the last decade or so, A lot of their housing was, of course, constructed by middle and large-scale firms, but it's, quite a lot of them were actually involved citizen participation in doing that. And in many parts of Asia, affordable housing is created through auto construction because communities come together to do this. So there are different solutions in different contexts. And while you can try and provide fiscal measures to make this happen, you can provide subsidies. I guess, like I said earlier, you have to segment the housing market in particular ways to try and understand what works in particular contexts. I think a colleague of ours is going to speak about this question later when we discuss the question of housing and how we can try and address that particular context.
So what Christopher would like to know is the expansion of urban areas a boon or a ban, and what could be the issues to urban sprawl, and how do they eventually lead to sustainability?
Well, this is again a contextual question. So in many parts of the world, the expansion of urban areas has led to sprawl, the creation of exurbs, so people can move around. I mean, this started in the 19th century with streetcars, and whether you look at New York or other cities that were created at that point in time, the railway led to the expansion of urban areas. The question, of course, is then related to whether that expansion actually led to a hierarchy of spaces in which some people are more privileged than others, where you find the inner city areas then either hollowing out or becoming the centers in which most of the informal activity is actually concentrated. So expansion per se is not a bad thing, but the question is, at what densities will this expansion actually function? Because as we know, as cities expand, the cost of delivery of infrastructure, for example, which is one of the most important reasons why cities are more economically active and why people come to them, becomes much more significant. So, there are multiple sort of responses hidden in that question. Do you nucleate? Do you try and sort of grow smaller places and build them into a system of systems where there's this hierarchy of settlements in a region where none of them grows very large, so they're easier to govern, they're much nicer places to live in. There's a big debate that's been going on forever on the question of optimal city size. But the key thing is that after you grow beyond a certain size, a whole range of environmental and risk factors actually start functioning to constrain the livability, the productivity, and let's say the sustainability of urban areas. So by and large, the heuristic people sort of use is that once you've grown beyond a certain size, you really need to try and consolidate the urban footprint. Cities like Vancouver did that by not allowing a freeway into the city, by actually having areas around the city that were agrarian lands that were fixed in land use using community land trust and a whole range of other processes. The city could actually not grow very significantly outside that, and by densifying and then sort of enabling a whole range of processes like access to the waterfront. I mean, Vancouver has a wonderful waterfront which is accessible to everybody. So there are different strategies that are used in different places, but uncontrolled growth is like a cancer. It's something that we should try and avoid as much as we can. It works in some circumstances, especially if it can be planned, which is very rare in cities of the global south. Then I think you might find a way in which you can balance out what we were talking about earlier. The trade-offs between different things, between employment, proximity, the quality of housing, the cost of land, and of course, the cost of providing the trunk infrastructure, which is quite important to enable all of this stuff to work.
Nandini would like to know, how do you reconcile the long-term timescale of urban development goals with the much faster, shorter cycle of government elections within such an embedded political landscape which is there in Indian cities?
Well, I guess this is not an Indian question. This is a question across the world. So, a few weeks ago, we were in a major meeting in Edmonton, and I was sitting with the mayor of Edmonton, who's very young, was a young politician who's very forward-looking. He's made a strong commitment to dealing with climate change, unlike many other North American cities. And I guess one of the questions we asked is, you've done this wonderful stuff, you're really, making this strong commitments as far as the city is concerned. What happens if you don't get re-elected? And I think that's a critical question, because leadership is important, political process is important, but continuity in terms of policy and programs is also very important, because if you're trying to build a metro system for a city, we know that it takes maybe 10, 15, 20 years to build it, and then it may last for 100 years. So you get locked into into a technology or a system of development which goes for a much longer period than the people who originally took that decision. So, cities across the world try and deal with this in many ways. One of the most important ways is by having a permanent bureaucracy. That's what a municipal system is, a municipal card is. It's a bureaucracy that actually maintains continuity between one cycle of election and another cycle of election. Of course, the challenge with bureaucracies is that over time they tend to ossify. Over time, they tend to be very conservative, and they find, as citizens, you can find many parts of the world, they find it very difficult to adapt to dramatic new change. So, for example, if you say in many cities across the world that you want to transform your current bus system from using diesel or gas in some cases to electric vehicles, many bureaucracies will be seriously challenged, while mayors may actually take it up as an election campaign and say that we're going to make this happen, and they become the agents of change. So we really have to balance out the opportunities that are created by these quick cycles of electoral changes, the long-term perspective and interests that are inherent in dealing with questions of sustainability and trade-off, and try and sort of balance them together. And different countries have done this differently, and different cities have done this differently, both in time and in space.
Sarah would like to know, now that the SDGs are finalized and a framework is in place, what tools are available to share the best practices across cities?
So there are a number of resources that are there. I think if you go to the websites of the major sort of global networks, whether it's UCLG or C40 or ICLE, or if you go to the STSN website, you'd see a handbook that we put together, I guess, a year and a half ago, that was trying to enable cities to prepare for sustainability. There are a whole range of tools that are available. The question that immediately comes up from that is whether a tool is universally applicable in every place. And I guess the quick answer to that is not. You have to look at your circumstance. You've got to do a baseline to understand what's happening in that particular place. There are some common steps that you can look at in preparing cities or neighborhoods to enable a transition to sustainability. And these are sort of common sense kind of things, but there are experiences in various parts of the world. For example, you do need to have a national framework, which we call a national urban policy or national framework, because cities sit within a larger frame. You need to have some kind of a regional development framework, because cities and urban areas draw their resources from them. They put their pollution and all the problems they have into the hinterlands. People move back and forth between that. So you need to have a spatial development framework to deal with that. You need to be able to address questions of energy, questions of governance, questions of financing, etc. So there is quite a lot of experience available across the world in trying to do this. The challenge is how to be able to implement that and deal with all of these complex issues at the same time. And that's why the job of city managers or mayors is so interesting. Because typically, as I've worked with them across the world in different places, they're focused not only on the short term, how do I clear the garbage tomorrow morning, but also questions of how I create economic, how I create economic opportunities, where do I bring the investment in, where do I raise the taxes from, and then how do I enable the development of a long-term ecological development plan for the region, which conserves, let's say, forest resources, deals with let's say, the riverfront or the waterfront at the same time. So they have to balance out a whole range of these questions, and there are no set answers to them. But like I said, there's a framework to start thinking about these, and I think what politicians and bureaucrats and planners and professionals are starting to do is to become a little bit more conversant with these ideas. They have a vocabulary to now talk about these questions. And when you break down the goals into the targets and indicators, then you get a much more clear idea of how to start implementing these questions. What things actually sit together. How can I bring economic development and proximity together? Does having a public transport system enable that? Do I need to finance it? If I do, then do I do it through property taxes, or do I draw the resources from the national government? These are all very practical questions that we'll have to address as we go forward in trying to address these questions.
I think one of the last questions that we'll be taking is it, Reggie wants to know, is it possible to impose a certain condition or designed for the cities to follow in order to make them sustainable?
Well, people have tried in many places. That's what master planning is all about. That's what grand designs are all about. But I would say in more places than one, people and the complexity of cities have actually overdone or outdone that. So yes, I mean, this is the idea that architects and planners have always had, that you can take a tabula rasa and you can build this beautiful thing that's there. But because these are emergent systems in which there are real people and real things, and things change. I mean, the history of cities is about change. And I mean, the best people to tell you about that is archaeologists. You go to any old city, and what you see when you talk about how Rome was, let's say, imagined in the 1st century, and what happened to it later. Rome was this great metropolis of the Mediterranean that drew in resources from this massive empire and concentrated in one location. It was rich, it was beautiful, it had 1 million people who lived at that point of time in great luxury. And then a few hundred years later, it was gone, and people were feeding cows and plowing in the center of the Forum in Rome. So, these ideas that you can direct things and processes, I think is challenging. I think we're more, as professionals in the space, we can try and redirect some forces. We can mold things and maybe shape them in certain directions. But the idea that you can control cities like you can control nature is something that I think the facts have kind of sort of upturned, not only generation after generation, but century after century.
The next question that we have is, seeing as how climate change is one of the biggest challenges we face.
Yeah, sorry, what about the
biggest challenges we face today? Do you see an intercontinental renewable energy grid as something we should all actively be working on?
Okay, that's a comment. This is an old idea, yeah? Go back to Buckminster Fuller. Bucky dealt with this question a long time back. He had this idea of this transcontinental grid that could connect Asia to North America and all kinds of interesting things. Now, in actual fact, this may become a reality. I mean, as the One Belt, One Road program from China expands, apart from the fact that we will have connections and connectivity which will happen through rail-based and port-based infrastructure across 70 countries as we understand it, I think one of the more important connections would really be the energy grids. And these energy grids could be driven by solar energy in some senses. So this might sound like science fiction, but think about a world in which, at least between Asia, Eurasia and Africa, you have a renewable energy grid that's driven by solar energy that connects up Shanghai on the east to Casablanca on the west, all connected by ultra-high voltage DC lines. I mean, the technology in some senses is here, especially as storage technologies become better. Then what would you have? You'd have the ability to be able to have a completely renewable-driven workday across maybe a 12-hour time zone. That's roughly the time zone between Morocco and China on the other side. So these are things that may well happen. But of course, they require a tremendous amount of cooperation, not only between national governments, but between cities, because cities are where the demand is going to come from. Cities are the place from where resources will actually flow, etc. So yes, these are questions that we should consider. I'm not sure that they will be accessible to everybody, but I think these transformations, at least some of them may come to pass.
I think the last question for the day will be, Mrinmay would like to know, are sustainable alternatives on a micro scale way ahead to bring out the sustainable concept in the cities?
Yeah, I mean, we have to work both top down and bottom up, like I said earlier. The opportunity that we have today is, unlike, let's say, 15, 20 years ago, where when you had set up an enterprise, if information had to go from one place to the other, it would go by post, or at the most you could use telephone. Today, you can actually interconnect through the internet and a whole range of other processes. You can connect, manufacturing, retail, trade, exchange of information, or what we're doing just now, pretty much across the world. So the ability to be able to take microscale activities and scale them through a network-based infrastructure is what we're experiencing. We're experiencing now the disruption of traditional forms of learning, where all of us can sit across, I would say, if I'm judging from people on this call, in Canada all the way up to East Asia, sitting across maybe 12, 14 hours in terms of time zones, and we can actually share experiences, we can share our concerns, we can share our solutions to particular problems, and we can debate these questions. So we can learn much, much, much faster. So the ability to establish these new ways of learning and integration are very real today, and they're changing the world as we speak. So absolutely, I mean, the opportunity of being able to scale bottom-up processes is very real at the current point in time. But that does not mean that you do not need higher levels of governance and organization. It's not as if everybody can become an island on their own and connect with each other on the internet and everything will be fine. You do need systems to aggregate and govern those processes. Otherwise, there would be utter chaos. So it doesn't mean that the state will wither away because of that. It'll mean that it will change form. It will also mean that we will have to experiment with new forms of economic, social, and in some senses political engagement. Today, in many parts of the world, it is possible for citizens to participate in the framing of the budget of a city and how the expenditure actually takes place. With a smartphone, you can actually track what's happening to a problem on your street, even if you are from a household that doesn't necessarily have a huge income. And if you're able to talk back and forth, hopefully you have a stronger voice than you would have had 5 or 10 years ago. But on the reverse, the same technologies and processes can be used for surveillance. So we have to everything has both a positive and a negative side to it. And cities are probably one of the greatest examples of that. Cities concentrate a huge amount of opportunity, but they also concentrate risk, they concentrate poverty, they concentrate inequality. And we have to learn how to be able to balance those out and contest them and enable those changes to move us forward in a direction that we collectively decide is what we want, rather than particular people or particular professions or particular elites deciding for us.
I think on that line, one of the questions that was posted on the forum was that Janice Barnes from NYC thinks that there has been a lot of movement on waste management and reduction in New York City. But she wants to know if there is a way to increase or enhance the efficiency of such efforts and not just focus on siloed efforts, but bring them together to make it more effective.
Yeah, New York is an interesting city. I know your mayor moderately well. The thing, of course, the simple thing as far as this is concerned, as far as waste is concerned, the simplest way of dealing with waste is not to create it. So we come back to our question of the circular economy. So if we actually produce less waste, whether it's in packaging, if it's in food waste, it is in the form of consumption that we have, obviously we're going to have to deal with less challenges in terms of recycling, end-of-life processes, etc., etc. So I think the waste challenge that we see in many parts of the world, in terms of landfills, in terms of incineration, etc., etc., etc. The root cause of that is not being able to address a very simple question, and that is, how much is enough? I mean, we've been caught over the, in the last 20 or 30 years, and Gordon talked about this in terms of the United States and many other countries in the world have been caught in this whole the idea of consumerism. Is how can we provide for everybody, first, in terms of what they need, and after that, in terms of what is actually possible for us to enable in the context of both inequality or access, but also in terms of what the planet can actually handle. And whether you look at the oceans at the current point of time, who are taking a very, very large proportion of the waste that we have, we can't actually see them, but they're very large portions of the oceans in the world which have turned into dead zones. In the Southern Ocean, which is really as far from habitation that you can see. So the first principle as far as waste is concerned is produce as little of it as you can. And if you do, then of course the simple thing which you find happening in New York, I would say to some extent, but if you go to Scandinavia and I spent a little time in Copenhagen, a few months ago, and there in typical neighborhoods you have 7 bins, and they may be going a little too far when they go further than that. They have 11 bins that are there. So you actually segregate into each of those waste chains that are there, and then each one of those waste chains are taken, and there's a full process which then converts them recycles them, especially if you have, a German kind of green pump kind of a system where you look at cradle to cradle kind of recycling of materials. Every manufactured product actually has, very well articulated process, so you're able to unbundle and go back to that process as much as you can. And some of it goes to energy, but eventually, if you're going to create that waste, you will create toxic waste of some kind, especially with electronics and a whole range of fancy gadgets we have. You will create biological hazardous waste because they're people and they will buy biohazards that they consume, which have to be dealt with. So you do have to have enterprise waste management systems. So you do have to have specialist systems to deal with certain kinds of waste. But if you produce less, you have a less complex system. You can recycle as much as you can, and you can reuse in other contexts. So I think we have very interesting examples from different parts of the world, especially from Europe, of moving to systems which actually do all three of these things. And I hope that New York or the greater New York, New Jersey region can move to that sooner rather than later. In other parts of the world, like in the global south, we have large numbers of people who actually do the job that you would actually do by segregating. There's a very interesting trade-off there between employment generation, the living conditions of the workers, and the very, very efficient systems that waste pickers in many parts of South Asia or Southeast Asia actually perform in maintaining the functioning of those cities.
Well, that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you very much, everyone, for all your interesting and engaging questions. Please keep an eye out on the discussion forum of the course for the next webinar, which will be scheduled very shortly. Thank you all again, and see you all again in the next webinar. Good night. Have a good evening.
Yeah. So good night, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's great to have spoken to you, and we'll catch up pretty soon. Stay on the course. This is a long course, so you will have to sort of brace yourself for it. But it's going to be great at the end of the process. We know that from a large number of people who have done this before.